to reply.
We'd actually be happy to spend another hour, and I think we badly need it, because there have been some very serious points raised here today, and there's been some incredibly inaccurate statements put on the record. And I have to say, they weren't put on by Deputy Rabbit Minister. Your own statements were inaccurate as well. Now, I have never, and I'll deal with them as they come up, I've never seen a situation where the government come in here with a bill and in the speech before the debate takes place say, well, we're not going to allow this go any further. Might be wrong. You might have done that before. Well, it's utterly scandalous that you would do it on such an important humanitarian issue. It's really not on. And the rationale for it, I have to say, is a little bit concerning and would not reflect your generally good approach to these issues, because Deputy Wallace is right. The conflation of us and our needs to provide services to refugees and asylum seekers, and putting that side by side, the housing crisis and all of the other problems, does contribute to racist views that refugees and migrants are the cause of those problems. You want to go back and look at whoever wrote the speech for you, because it was heading in that direction. Now, I'm appalled by the fact that we have our government here congratulating Ireland that we've managed to pick up what the Australians aren't going to use in their E3 visas in America. Now, these American visas were negotiated with the Australian government in thanks and recognition for the help that the Australians gave the Americans in the Iraq War. And we're congratulating ourselves that we're going to be given access to the visas that the Australians don't use. And yet we here are not going to provide refuge or family reunification for the victims of the Iraq War. And you're not. And I'll give you a few examples of why you're not, because the example given by Deputy Wallace about the 18-year-old who was from Syria, you're absolutely right. A Syrian in that situation could apply under the humanitarian scheme because he's from the top 10 countries and he can fight it out there. He may or may not get it. If that young man was from Iraq, he wouldn't get it. He's not on the list. He's not on the list. And you said to me, if you can give me an example of the scenario that I outlined at the you deal with that. I'll give you the scenario. It's the Act itself. It says where the sponsor is under 18 and is not married, his or her parents and their children, who on the date of the application are under the age of 18, can come. By default, it's particularly clear that if he's not under 18, he can't bring his parents, because nowhere else are parents mentioned. And the point that was made is that if somebody comes here under the age of 18, they don't get their status before that, then they cannot bring their parents. Now, I'm not going to repeat the examples that were given, but you're wrong to point out that the Act was passed by a big majority in this House, because as Deputy Rabbit quite correctly said, it was passed by a big majority in the House. But now we've seen the consequences of that Act, and we've seen some of the problems that it's caused on families by the scientific study done by Roisin Hines. And the examples I gave in the introductions are real examples. A Syrian who came here, who by the time he found his daughter, she was a 19-year-old, he couldn't bring her here because the 12 months had elapsed before that happened. The woman, the African woman in direct provision, who'd been there for so long that one of her daughters was 20 when she went to make the application. The other smaller children then wouldn't come. They didn't want to leave the 20-year-old on their own. That mother is there. The granny left in Greece. They're real cases. They're not made up. And we're not talking about huge numbers. I mean, it's completely wrong for the Minister to turn around and talk about an open scheme, or what did you say in the thing, an open-ended scheme, and broadening the definition. And you talk about a drain on resources, that houses and all this sort of stuff are going to have to be provided for. I actually think this bill should be amended because it's too restrictive. We're talking about dependence. And a dependent isn't going to require a separate house for themselves. We're talking about very small numbers of people, and the reason why I'm sure about that is that all we're looking for is the scheme that was in place previously, where on average there was about 2 people applied for with every family. So it's not true to say that this is going to cause an enormous drain on the resources. It's also not true to say that the humanitarian scheme is a better scheme. Well, for starters, we're not opposing. You can have your humanitarian scheme, Nobody is objecting to that. It's fine. And if you think it's brilliant and it's working, carry on. Bringing in this legislation isn't going to stop you doing that. But what it will do is give an opportunity. That scheme is limited to 530 places. Very, very restrictive, actually, even in the context of the small numbers of refugees that we've given asylum to. And if you're somebody from Iraq, if you're maybe a Shia in Bahrain where you're being persecuted, if you're in Yemen or these places, well, tough. You're not covered by the humanitarian scheme. It's only the top 10 from those countries. So those people are excluded. And the people who came here under 18 are excluded. They can't bring their parents. We are condemning them to remain here alone. You said to Deputy Rabbit, oh, sure, look, apart from the humanitarian scheme, which all those people I mentioned can't apply for, you told her, well, they can come under the non-EEA national permit thing. You have to earn $30,000 a year to avail of that scheme. Not really accessible to somebody who comes here seeking asylum. They're not really in the jobs market to that type of money to get in here. So that's not an avenue for these vulnerable people there. So I think it's disingenuous to say that. And I totally agree with the points made by Deputy O'Snuddig that the idea now that we are ahead of the posse and to the forefront of our initiatives is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it really is. And to have you repeat and again get into the remit of Operation Sophia, which finally we managed to get the Minister for Defence to admit is a military operation. It's written in the terms of the Act. It is a military operation. Doctors Without Borders told Foreign Affairs Committee that what it's doing, it's helping the Libyan Coast Guard return people to rape, slavery, torture and murder. That's what that operation is. Now, if you're proud of that, fair play to you. I'm actually, frankly, utterly ashamed of it, and I'm particularly ashamed of it in the fact that we are complicit, given our use of Shannon, to allow a lot of the wars that displaced these people in the first place. So, I think, in conclusion, I was going to make lots of points about where we did let people down. The children, the unaccompanied minors that we let down in the past who came into our care system. Let's remember, 454 separated children in Ireland went missing in Ireland in between 2000 and 08. Only 58 of them ever turned up. Suspicions of them being pimped and trafficked and so on. Obviously that situation improved then when we changed the system and we allowed those accompanied minors go from not being in hostels but being accommodated with families, linked up with social workers, and we have a good scheme there, so the numbers were impacted on. We learned from the mistakes of the policies that we put in place, and that's what we want the Minister to do here now. It's a fact that the only people who can be included now are parents of people who are under 18, spouses and children of under 18. And of those, you're leaving out many vulnerable dependents. We're talking about small numbers here. I mean, in actual fact, I think if we could get this into committee, I'd like to see it extended, because I'll give you an example of a family that I'm friendly with, a young man who came here under 18, still under 18. His father was killed, his broader family, his mother and his younger brother have joined him. His older brother is the only person left. He's at home on his own. They're all over here. Under this bill, even if this was passed, I don't think he'd qualify. Because how could I say that he's a dependent on a 17-year-old? It's the unaccompanied minor. That's how restrictive this bill is. It's really, as Senator Kelleher, it's an incredibly modest proposal. And you know what? It won't even deal with many of the families out there that we'd like to be helping to reunite. And I think it's sending a very wrong signal if the government doesn't go back between now and next Thursday, when this will be voted upon, and really look at it. And particularly you, Minister, as someone who has been to the forefront of these issues. A lot of the information in your criticisms of Deputy Rabbit were actually wrong. They're factually inaccurate in terms of what the legislation provides for now. And again, I come back to, you've hidden behind the humanitarian scheme, but nobody is asking you to replace the humanitarian scheme. We're asking you to go back to recognise the proper definition of family for the purposes of reunification under the International Protection Act. So, look at, I'm begging you really, just go back and look at it, because a lot of what we put on the record, if you really believe that you want to help people, go back and look at the facts. We're talking about small numbers of examples of people who've been caught in that trap. We're talking about dependency. We're talking about vulnerable people, and we're leaving them high and dry if this bill is not. It's going to progress. It's going to be passed by this House. But if you block that with a money message, you're particularly disingenuous, particularly in light of the points made by Angus that this whole system of money messaging is going to change soon. But how many families are you going to destroy in the meantime?
Thank you, Deputy. That concludes the debate, and I now must put the question. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Is that agreed?
No. Agreed. Agreed.
Okay.